I am so excited to have President Freeman A. Hrabowski III as our keynote speaker tonight. I have never met anyone who loves learning as much as President Hrabowski. When he was young, his parents used to placate him by giving him math problems to solve. President Hrabowski's love of learning is only rivaled by his love of teaching. We are in for a treat tonight. After hearing President Hrabowski, you too will know how cool it is to be smart and how insightful President Hrabowski is. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, President Freeman A. Hrabowski III.
Hello, I'm Freeman Hrabowski, president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, UMBC. I am honored to be with you this evening. I have such admiration for J. Franklin Bourne and for this bar association. When I think about the legacy of this giant, I think about the word excellence. When I think about excellence, I think about all to which we are aspiring. And so I begin with poetry. In these challenging times, we need poetry more than ever. William Carlos Williams said, "It's difficult to find news in poetry, and yet men and women die miserably every day because of a lack of what's found there." And I will use words from Langston Hughes. Those of us who are Hamptonians know that our professors and others were always talking about Langston Hughes and reaffirming what our parents had given us. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow. I use that with my students all the time, and it is the notion that without dreams, without our imagination, without some vision of who we want to be, we tend to move in the opposite direction, not up, but down. And so my message today to you, as some of the most impressive professionals of any race in the world, is that the way we think about ourselves, the language that we use, the way we interact with each other, the values that we hold will be so important. We become like the things that we love. Our dreams and our values shape us, not only today, but in the future for generations to come. I am from UMBC, a campus that has students from 100 countries. At least 20+% of our students are from Prince George's County and Montgomery County, almost 25% of all races. We've got more than half the students who have one parent at least from another country, whether they are from one of the African countries, Nigeria probably the largest number, to the islands, to the Caribbean, whether it's Jamaica, Barbados, and others. But other students who are from right here in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, and down on the Eastern Shore. And the message that I want you to think about is the power of education. The power of education. Where would anyone here be? The ineluctable question is, where would you be if it were not for an education? Each of us has a story, and while I am in Baltimore and have been there for years and years, I am a native of Birmingham. I'm a very proud Southerner. People here in Maryland sometimes consider themselves Southern. You tell me. Other times, not as much. I would call Baltimore, Prince George's County, D.C., the Upper South. The Upper South. But I am from the Deep South. Those of us who are from Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana have this sense of the possibilities and the tragedies all in one sentence, in the same way that others around the country, but there's something about the Deep South. And all of you, at one point, if you're not with parents or grandparents from another country, come out of that region for the most part. And so why do I tell you that? Well, Southerners in general can tell stories. We can weave a story. And if I gave you a math theory, I'm a nerd in math. UMBC is a place where math rocks. And I've always loved math. But my mother was an English teacher. And she had grown up as a child maid. She preferred to work in a wealthy home as a little kid rather than in the hot cotton fields because she wanted to see how rich people lived. And the woman allowed her to use the library at a time when there was no library for children of color. And here's the significance of that story. The more my mother read, the better a reader she became. And the more proficient a reader she became, the more she loved to read. And people would say that's a special little girl because her reading skills led to her being able to write with clarity, and her speaking began to distinguish her from others. And all of a sudden, my mother knew exactly what she wanted to do for the rest of her life, to become a teacher. She said, teachers touch them all, the lawyers, the doctors, and everybody. They have to come through the teachers. And she would always quote Zora Neale Hurston in her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing until the watcher turns his head away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men, and my mother would say, and women. And Hurston, like Hughes, was talking about not just the importance of dreams, but about two types of people. People whose dreams become reality, all of us. And then people who, in the words of Langston Hughes, see their dreams deferred. And the biggest difference between those two groups will be education. Now, why do I spend so much time talking about literature and poetry? Because we're living in such challenging times. It's very easy to be very discouraged and to get down into the weeds of the challenges we face on an everyday level, or to think about the big picture and the major issues, whether it's about COVID or about structural racism or about the economy or about politics. And somehow we have to be able to rise above it all for a moment and say, but where are we going? What do we plan to accomplish? What is it we must do? You know, it is significant that Mr. Bourne had begun to practice law in the 50s and was that first black to do that. But we're still dealing with firsts. And while on the one hand, that's a great accomplishment for those individuals, it is a challenge that we're still dealing with firsts. That so many law firms, for example, still don't have their first black senior partner, if partner at all. I am delighted to talk about my alumni all the time. Harry Johnson, many of you know, was that first black president of the Maryland State Bar Association back in about 2003. That's not even been 20 years. And then someone I consider a daughter, Alicia Wilson, who went to Mervo, a trade school in Baltimore. A trade school where people sometimes aspire to become cosmetologists, as an example, who had the grit, as we talk about at UMBC, and the vision to do all that her capacity would allow her to do, and came to UMBC, did wonderfully, went on to the University of Maryland and passed the bar, and by age 30 had become the first black partner at Gordon Feinblatt, one of the prestigious law firms, most prestigious in Baltimore. And now she is vice president at Hopkins. And so I want you to think about dreams and about all those little girls who are being told they want to be cosmetologists. Nothing wrong with being a cosmetologist, but we want people to have the breadth of possibilities. That child who could have easily been pushed in one way, who somehow had people who believed in her and to take her God-given talents. And now here she is, one of the senior leaders at Johns Hopkins University, having done so much for the city of Baltimore. And so keep that thought about children and their dreams on the one hand. And then listen to me for a moment, talk about one more story. When I was 12, it was the time of Dr. King in Birmingham in 1963. And I will never forget sitting in the back of church, listening to a man talk. And I didn't want to be in church in the middle of the week. My parents were placating me by letting me do math problems and my eating. I was always getting fatter and smarter, they said all the time. They like those cheats in the South, you know that. And all of a sudden, this gentleman says, if the children participate in this peaceful protest, all of America will understand that even our babies, our young people, know the difference between right and wrong. And our children will be able to go to better schools. Now, we had some great teachers who worked so hard. They did not have the resources and the opportunities that those educators and quite frankly, the better paid people in those schools had. And so I was interested in doing it because we were being told in so many ways that we were not as good as smart as those white children. And we were given hand-me-down books. And it was not even possible sometimes for my parents to buy the new books because no child should be different from other children. So we just all had sometimes to use those torn-up books. It was an awful experience for children to know that the society didn't really think they mattered, that those black children did not matter. And yet I went to jail and I marched and went to jail. A horrible experience. We were treated like animals, like slaves, not enough bathrooms, children. I was 12. A lot of the kids were younger. And it was horrific that America treated us as if we were criminals because we wanted a better education. And yet, within a matter of days, Dr. King came outside the jailhouse with our parents, and they sang songs, and we're looking out, and I've got little kids, and I'm responsible for, and they're crying, wanting to get out from, and it's smelling, and we're so scared. And he said, Dr. King said to all of us, what you children do this day will have an impact on children not yet born, and children are crying, and they're not even understanding the profundity of what he's saying, but they know it means something, that there is hope. And I'm thinking the whole time, what will happen to us? We get out, and terrible experience of being put out of school because we had marched. And it did take going through the courts to the federal level to get children put back in school for social protest. And people were saying, shame on you, Birmingham City Schools. Now, why do I tell you that? We are going through social protests right now. My students ask me the question, what do you think about these protests? Well, social protests and demonstrations are a critical part of our democracy. You know this. This is the opportunity for people to speak the truth, to express their concerns, and to let people know this is not acceptable when things happen. But the question becomes, after the protest, what? And I would tell you that we can learn from history. We need to understand our history so that it can shine light on where we are today and where we may go as we dream about the future. And here is the message, that after that period, in 1963, when you had the March on Washington after our challenge, when you had the bombing of the 4 little girls, when we saw the killing of our beloved President John Kennedy, who was speaking up for black children, the question was, what's going to happen? It could not get worse than this. And yet somehow we were all surprised when people with Dr. King and others worked with the then President Lyndon Johnson and others, and we had legislation. There were a lot of lawyers, including black lawyers, working to do what we could to change the rules of the game. And this is why lawyers and the training you have can give you tools to help us begin to address these issues of structural racism. And so before we knew it, we had the Civil Rights Act, we had the Voting Rights Act, we had the Higher Education Act, all between 63 and 65. And the world was transformed in this country in many ways. One example, if I were there with you now, I'd ask you, what percent of Americans do you think in the mid-60s had graduated from college? The fact is, it was only 10%. And then I asked, well, what about blacks? And it ends up it's between 3 and 4%, almost all of whom would have come from one of the HBCUs, with few examples, with few exceptions. And then for whites, though, you'd think 20, 30%, it was only 11%. Only 11% for whites, 3 to 4% for blacks, overall 10%. Today, we're up to about 30% of Americans with a 4-year college degree. We're delighted that more and more people are getting that 2-year institution degree, a community college. Community colleges are more important than ever. The 2 you've got here, in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, are first-rate institutions. We get many wonderful students from those institutions. But the fact is that today, only 30% of Americans have graduated from college, under 40% of whites, about 23, 24% of blacks. The Latino population today, still only about 15%. The Asian population, slightly over 50%. But hear me saying this. 2/3 of Americans today, across the races, have never had anyone in their families graduate from college. And there is a part of the challenge that we face. But at the same time, what I would say to you is this is a time when people are saying no more. We need to address these issues of structural racism. You, as people with your legal backgrounds and other types of education, have the chance to help people understand that structural racism goes across our society on every level. Yes, we've got police brutality, but that's the tip of the iceberg. It's horrible when people are killed. But when you look at the impact of the prejudices, the discrimination, the structural racism on our communities, and you see the resulting violence of children killing children, that has so much to do with not blaming victims, but with what society has done to our communities. Whether talking about criminal justice, as you know, and the need for great reform, or talking about health disparities, or the academic achievement gap, or the fact that so many families don't have someone with the skills to have a job. There's so many factors there. And so for a few minutes, I want to talk about underrepresentation as one measure of the kind of structural racism impact that we're seeing in our society. People think, oh, there are plenty of black lawyers. Well, no, you know this. When I look at the data in 1960, around the time when Mr. Bourne had just begun practicing there in the 50s, you had about 1% of the lawyers were black. And then right now we're up to maybe 5%. But when you look at jobs and you look at opportunities and you look at the highest paying, we are still so terribly underrepresented. The same thing is true in medicine. We're up to about 5%. And we know that there are fewer black males in medical school today than there were than that we found in the 80s. And the area where my campus has made tremendous progress that I want you to think about is, as you know, in science, in STEM. As I said, I'm a mathematician. I get goosebumps during math. But I will tell you, my mother, who had been an English teacher, became a math teacher. And I learned from her that if you want a child to be able to do something in STEM, whether it is in math or chemistry or in physics or in engineering or pre-med, you've got to start with reading skills. This is what I want you to keep in mind. If you give me a child who can read well, I can teach her to solve word problems. And physics, engineering, chemistry are all word problems, math-based. And so we must teach our children to read more critically. We must teach our children to understand distinctions between what is fact and what is opinion. We must teach our children to be able to listen carefully, not just our children, but ourselves, to listen carefully to the issues. And so what I want you to think about is the fact that we're still with under 2% of the scientists in our country at all the national agencies, under 2%, barely 1% are African American. So here in the corridor, the Baltimore-Washington corridor, where we have the largest percentages of scientists at the National Institutes of Health, all the way over to the National Security Agency, to the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. You can go on and on and on. It was significant that a fellow Birminghamian, Willie May, became the head of NIST, coming out of that same segregated black school system. A chemist, Willie May. So we've got these great examples. But when we look at the totality of it, what we see is that very few blacks are represented in science, even when talking about health disparities, where we know blacks and Latinx people a large percentage of the challenge and that we die sooner. The fact that the children who went to jail with me, when we went to jail, and people say today, where are the kids now? So many are dead because they came out of the projects. If you're poor, you die sooner. If you're a teacher's child, you got a chance of doing better and moving on. But the fact that I want you to think about is that we need to understand what we need to do to address the issue of underrepresentation, even as we talk about the structural issues in our society. And that's so after the protests, the questions of what should be the legislation, what should be the difference in policies, how do we focus on anti-racism, not just not being, when people say I'm not a racist, no, an anti-racist, as Brother Kendi says, has everything to do with the proactive approach of addressing these inequalities that we're talking about. And so nothing could be more important than talking about the vote, as you know, how critical the vote is, because we have to vote in people who have values that we agree with so that we can change the policies and the rules, whether about healthcare or about education or about criminal justice. And so I want you to bask in the success of my campus for a minute. When I tell you that in the midst of this challenge of COVID, of structural racism highlighted in our society, of the economic issues, that we are stepping up. We are stepping up. And this Mile Scholars Program, many of whom have come from your counties, Prince George's and Montgomery County, these students are doing remarkably well. We have 4 black males right now who are on the faculty at Duke. I mean, in tenure track and tenured positions, including endowed chairs, coming out from Roosevelt High School to Springbrook High School in Montgomery County and others. And that these are former athletes who are MD PhDs in 3 cases. And in the case of Damon Tweedy, who wrote the book Black Man in White Coat, MD JD. MD from Duke, JD from Yale. They're all professors. They're writing articles all the time for the New York Times to Science Magazine. And so I tell you that as inspiration. And if you say, well, how did we do it? I want you to look at my TED Talk, which focuses on high expectations, not just of students, but of ourselves, that we as faculty can do much more. Because most students who go to college, especially when it's very socially prestigious places, who start off in engineering or science, get wiped out. We call the first year of science in America weed out courses. So it's high expectations, not just for our students and for our families, but also for the faculty, for the universities. What are we doing to make sure students' dreams become fulfilled? And secondly, building community, as you have done with this bar association, building community among students so they're not fighting each other, so they do more together than party, that they work hard to make a difference. And number 3, really critical, that it takes scientists to produce scientists, but I will tell you this, it takes lawyers to produce lawyers. It takes artists to produce artists. Whatever your discipline and your gift, as you talk about how we get more into that field, you got to pull them in. You got to help them with those reading skills and those thinking skills and to dream about what they might do. Who would have known that somebody who was a first partner at age 30 at a big law firm, Alicia, could then go on and work for Kevin Plank and to do all kinds of things in the city of Baltimore in economic development and then become a senior vice president for economic development at Hopkins, all the opportunities that are there. And then finally, evaluation. So those 4 pillars of success on my TED Talk have everything to do with success, not just in science, but in general. And so I leave you with the idea that when you take that vaccine, and you must, that'll be out soon, I want you to remember that the person, the scientist, the brilliant scientist who has led the team at NIH, who now has a patent on that COVID vaccine affiliated with Moderna, is a black woman. This is the first time. This is history. I get goosebumps thinking about it. One of my students that we recruited from Hillsborough, North Carolina, from the country, who comes up here when people think about people from the South and black people and women not doing these kinds of things. And here she is. God has blessed her to be the one who is with the patent on that vaccine right now. Kizzmekia Corbett, Corbett. Look her up. An amazing human being. She is a Malhoff who went on to, after graduating from UMBC to Chapel Hill, back at NIH, who lives in this area in Maryland right now. And then the leading young neuroscientist in the world got the award this year, Khafre Zarasa, coming out of Springbrook High School, another Malhoff. So when you think about the significance of representation, if we want more people to appreciate science and medicine and vaccines, they've got to see people like themselves there, just as we need them to see lawyers and what lawyers can do. I leave you with this message. Sitting in that jail more than 50 years ago, I could never have imagined being president of a university that would produce a black woman to become the first Speaker of the House of the state of Maryland, or the first black woman to create this vaccine, or to be the #1 producer of blacks who go on to complete MD PhDs in the country. We have produced more blacks who are now MD PhDs than any university in the history of our country. This is about vision and people buying into that vision on our campus. We can do this in all professions. What we need is to remember Bourne's legacy of excellence. Aristotle said excellence is never an accident. And he ends the quote by saying, choice, not chance, determines destiny. And there is the ineluctable question for each of us. What do we choose? Dreams and values. Keep hope alive. Thank you.